Let me tell you about the museum, what we are, and it's really appropriate this year because it's our 50th anniversary. The museum was started by the Air Force out on Kirtland Air Force Base, and they operated it for about 5 years, and they decided they wanted to get out of the museum business, so they were going to close it down. But fortunately for the museum, also on the base is at that time, ERDA, which is Energy Research and Development Administration, now DOE. They did not want to close it. So they took the museum over and assigned its day-to-day operations to Sandia Laboratories. Sandia operated the museum until 1991, and that's when we became a national museum chartered by an act of Congress through Department of Energy. There are only 38 national museums in the country. 30 of them are in Washington, D.C., so there are only 8 of them out west here. The museum was on the base then until 9/11. And the day the Twin Towers came down, the security police from the base came in and said, "Get your things, you're to leave immediately." So they gathered everyone up and actually escorted us off the base. So the museum's on the base, we can't get to it. It took us about 6 months to arrange to move down by Old Town in what was the old REI building down there, right between the other museums that are just north of Old Town. We were there 7 years in a leased building, trying to get enough money to put together our facility on South Eubank. We've now also been here 10 years, so that's another anniversary this year. And we continually upgrade the facility. We're a nonprofit private foundation, so what all the monies that we get, we don't have deep-pocketed sponsors. So the visitors and the other tour groups and rentals are all part of our income. One of the questions I've gotten here at the museum is, why is the museum located in Albuquerque? Why isn't it somewhere else in the country? And there is one answer, and that's J. Robert Oppenheimer. I'll be referring to him as his nickname, Oppie. Oppie is the one that located the Pajarita Plateau on the east side of the Jemez. But how did that all come about? And to explain that, I really need to go back into his early childhood. He was born in the Bronx, New York, to a Jewish family. His father was an immigrant, came over, and became very successful. He lived the American dream. They got rich by importing textiles. So while Oppie was a very frail boy, very sickly, but very brilliant, went to a private school back in the Bronx there. When he was about to graduate, they went over to Europe, and Oppie caught trench dysentery, which turned into colitis. He was about 5'10", but never weighed over 130, very frail. His dad wanted to try to toughen him up, so he recruited Oppie's English teacher to bring him down to the Southwest to toughen him. So that summer they came down. Fortunately, for the museum, Harold Smith is his name, the English teacher, chose the Santa Fe area. Also, they were acquainted with a family that also had a boy at that school in the Bronx, the Fergusons. Fergusons had a place up in Pecos, New Mexico, so they started out there. Oppie, they went up the Pecos River up to a ranch up there called the Los Pinos Guest Ranch, who had horses. The ranch belonged to the Chavez family, and the daughter operated the ranch house. Her name was Catherine Chavez. Oppie was infatuated with her. She was a pretty young woman, and so they got along real well. She taught him how to ride. And so he would explore the Pecos and the Jemez in really week-long pack trips that they would make out horseback riding. One of these trips was over to the Pajarita Mesa, where Los Alamos is now located. So they became really in love with the Southwest. He got improved health, graduated from Harvard in 3 years, and when he graduated from Harvard, he went over to do his PhD in Germany. And when he'd finished his PhD, coming back during that period of time, he got a light case of TB. And so he and his brother Frank then again came down to the Southwest and again did a lot of exploring. They actually rented or leased a ranch up on the upper end of the Pecos River, north of Cowles, for those of you that know the area up there. They leased the ranch, and once the lease went through, Oppie's response was, "Hot dog." And so Catherine then translated that into Spanish, perro caliente. The problem, though, is that they didn't realize that the idiom in Spanish, perro caliente, means dog in heat, not hot dog. So that was their ranch there. They finally ended up buying that place, and it is actually still in the Oppenheimer family now. Oppenheimer then became involved with the first committees on the Manhattan Project after Leo Szilard wrote the letter to President Roosevelt starting the Manhattan Project. And he was a consultant on to those committees. Once the Manhattan Project was underway under General Leslie Groves, General Leslie Groves picked him then as the Director of Research and Development. The two of them then, they wanted to get away from the coasts. All our research being done in uranium were at the big universities like Columbia and Harvard and Princeton on the East Coast, and out in Berkeley and Caltech out in California. They wanted to pull that research and development together for better organization, plus the security then to get them away from the coast. So Oppie recommended then, well, what about the Santa Fe area? So they had a committee came down and went around, and General Groves got involved in that committee. They started out by looking at the area around Jemez Springs on the west side of the Jemez, and decided that canyon was too deep. It didn't have enough area for a laboratory. They wanted a fairly flat area. Also, they were worried about it flooding, the Hamas River flooding. So they went around then on the east side to the Pajarita Plateau area and went up to the Los Alamos Boys School. And once they got in there, General Groves said, "This is it. This is where we're going to put our R&D facility." So, of course, it's named Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory now. And then from that then, after the end of the war, the components of the weapon, the scientific part of a nuclear weapon is what we call the physics package. It's the nuclear material, explosives, and detonators. Everything to make that into a deliverable weapon that can be safely delivered accurately on target is done by the ordnance side of the Manhattan Project. You got the scientific side and you've got the weapons side. After the war then, that weapons side and all the people and components from that were moved down here to Albuquerque and located on what was then Sandia Base. Sandia Base now has been involved now as just Kirtland. It was rolled into Kirtland. And then that component then was renamed the Sandia branch of the Los Alamos, and that in 1949 then became Sandia Laboratories under the administration of the AEC at the time. So with the weapons work down here in Albuquerque, along with Kirtland Air Force Base here, and the close link then between the Atomic Energy Commission and the military here, it was natural then that the museum also be located here in Albuquerque. Well, one of the things that motivates me here as a docent is that over the 20 years, I've realized that very few people know anything about the history of the atomic bomb. They come in completely just no information. And also with younger people, you show them a picture of Hitler and they can't identify him. And so one of my motivations is to try to explain the history and what happened, because I'm one that believes that if you don't learn history, you're bound to repeat it. And there's certain things in our history we sure don't want to repeat. And that's the things like the bombing of Japan or Nazi Germany. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the history of the atomic bomb, which is one of our major exhibits. At the museum, we're really in three areas of subject. One is the history of the atomic bomb from the earliest remnants of it in the 1930s in Nazi Germany, clear through to our current weapons that are on display at the museum. The other two subject matter areas is nuclear medicine, and then we also have energy ending in nuclear reactors. So it's a very wide spectrum covering all of nuclear science. The history of the atom bomb then starts really with the discovery of the neutron. That was in 1932 by James Chadwick. Up until that time, we only knew that a nucleus involved a proton and an electron. The problem that they knew about, though, is that they could only explain less than half the mass of the nucleus. Where was the other half mass? Today, we're looking at almost the same problem, and we only know about 10% of the mass of the universe. Where's the other 90%? Dark energy, dark matter, where is it? They're hunting for that today in physics. So we only knew about half the mass of the, and that's when James Chadwick then discovered the neutron. And that explained then the total mass of the nucleus. That went on till about 1939 then, from 32 to 39. Physicists were in their labs bombarding anything they could think of with neutrons to see what they would get. Science at that time believed that it was impossible to split the nucleus. You couldn't hit it hard enough to actually break it apart. They discovered, though, that the nucleus of fissionable material, such as uranium, could absorb a neutron, and the nucleus would explode. And that was done in a lab in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, Germany, by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, and really the brains of the group. They were both radiochemists, and the brains of the group was a theoretical physicist, Lisa Meitner, and she and her nephew, Otto Frisch, explained what happened when it split. Otto and Fritz couldn't figure out what they had. They split uranium and got barium. Uranium is element 92, barium is 56. Well, that was impossible. How could they do that? Lisa was able to explain that. She only explained it, but she was able to calculate the amount of energy released when it split. Fantastic accomplishment. Again, once that nucleus was split, again, the physicists all headed back into their labs and started bombarding everything they could think of with neutrons to see what would happen. What happens when the nucleus splits? If you have one neutron going in and it splits and you get two out, then each generation will double the number of fissions. And Lisa Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch are the ones that named that process fission. You can get a doubling then very quickly. In a microsecond or two, you can get as high as 80 doublings, and before the whole thing will just blow apart. Well, if you take 2 to the 80th power, you get a tremendous large number, even though the number of each fission is very, very small. By the time you multiply it by 2 to the 80th power, and I calculated that out, it's 1.4 with 31 zeros after it, fissions per second. That's where you get what's called the rapid rise, an exponential rise. It's and that leads then to a bomb. We knew the Germans could do that thanks to Leo Szilard, who tried to warn us of that. He was unable to really get any traction. He was Jewish and had immigrated over here. But also Albert Einstein had immigrated over. Leo was a student of Einstein. They were very close in Berlin there. They both had to come over here as a result of the Holocaust. Leo realized that he wasn't getting any traction, warning us that the Germans could build an atomic bomb. And so he was very shrewd, though, a shrewd politician. He knew that if he could get Albert Einstein to sign a letter that he had written to President Roosevelt that might get things rolling. So he wrote the letter and got Einstein to sign it. Even that was a problem because Einstein was a strict pacifist. He wanted nothing to do with killing people. He did convince Einstein, though, that if Hitler got the bomb first, he would use it and we would lose World War II. So Einstein signed the letter, it went on to President Roosevelt, and that got the ball rolling. And that was in 1939, before we entered World War II. At the same time, there was an Italian physicist that had discovered that to have the neutron absorbed by another nucleus, you had to slow it down. When you have that neutron come out, it's traveling very fast, very energetic, and it flies right by another nucleus. So you got to slow it down so it hangs around long enough to be absorbed by the other fissionable nucleus. And that's called moderation. And you do that then with a couple materials they figured out. One is deuterium or heavy water, and the other is graphite. And so Enrico Fermi, the Italian, had also immigrated to the United States. He wasn't Jewish, but his wife was. And so they immigrated over here. They were at Columbia University. Leo Szilard was there too. But before Enrico came over, he had that concept of the moderation, slowing down the neutron. And that was in 1934, and I like that date because that was the date I was born, so I can always remember that as a historian. In 1938, he got the Nobel Prize for that in discovery. And at that time, the Holocaust was just getting down to Rome, and his wife was Jewish. They knew they had to leave, so they sold everything they had, converted to diamonds, to go up to get his Nobel Prize. The problem here, though, is that he was also Mussolini's pet scientist. Mussolini called him my Italian Einstein. Mussolini's instruction to him was that you're not to bow to the King of Sweden, who gives the Nobel. You have to give him the fascist salute. And because your allegiance is to Mussolini, not to the King of Sweden. So Enrico goes up, he bows the King of Sweden. They get a $40,000 prize and got on the boat and just escaped and got to the United States. They ended up at Columbia University. And so did Leo Szilard. We were both there, both operating in different laboratories, working the same problem. And that problem is, if a neutron goes into a nucleus, it splits, how many do you get out? Turns out the answer, now we know it's 2.4 on the average. They figured that, well, 2 goes out. That would support a chain reaction then, leading eventually to a bomb. To try to make that happen then, they built a series of big blocks of graphite, which is one of the materials that will slow down the neutrons. And by putting pieces of uranium in it, they were able to get beginnings of chain reactions. They went through about 30 of these, keep building them up and up and up, and they called them logarithmic piles. They finally then, in November of 1942, they started building in Chicago the first reactor. That was initially put in the squash court underneath the west stands of Stagg Field. And that was empty because the University of Chicago had given up football in 1939, so the stands were empty. They built in 17 days, working 24 hours a day. They built the Chicago Pile 1 with 400 tons of graphite and 40 tons of natural uranium. We have one of these bricks from the original 42,000 bricks that were of graphite that were machined to build the pile. We have one of these blocks on display at the museum. In December 2nd, 1942, they were able to bring it up and have a self-sustained controlled chain reaction. They could control it by having rods of cadmium that they could pull out or push in. Cadmium absorbs neutrons, so they could control the number of neutron fissions that were going on. Once that reactor worked, they knew they could build a bomb. They knew they had enough scientific knowledge about the process that a bomb was possible. And so that then gave more impetus to the scientists to go ahead and develop the bomb. Our problem is we didn't know what the Germans were up to. We had to assume that they were full bore ahead, knowing that if Hitler got the bomb first, it would be disaster. We thought they were about 2 years ahead of us. But then after the Pearl Harbor and the war started, then the letter from Einstein that had been in committees all at once gained momentum, and they formed the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project then was put under the direction of General Leslie Groves. Groves got the assignment because he had just gotten credit for building the Pentagon, 6,500,000 square feet of floor space. He built it in 11 months under budget. So he had the reputation of being able to get things done. He immediately then picked J. Robert Oppenheimer to do the research and development, and Groves retained then the administrative and logistics portions of the project. Once the Manhattan Project then actually got underway under Groves, things developed very quickly. They set up Los Alamos in just 6 months. They found the location up there. There was only one road from Santa Fe up to Los Alamos at that time. It took 3 hours to drive up there from Santa Fe. They bought up 54,000 acres up there, and including the Los Alamos Boys Ranch, and which is now the heart of the Los Alamos community, and went into the actual research and development. They realized very early that it wasn't so much a physics problem, but it was a materials problem. It was chemistry and metallurgy. It's very difficult to separate the fissionable part of uranium from non-fissionable. It's only 0.7%, and that is mass 235, U-235. The mass of the non-fissionable is U-238, only 1% difference in mass. You can't separate them chemically because they're the same atomic number 92. You have to separate them based upon the difference in the mass. And to do that, you have to use a thing today, which is a centrifuge. You spin it fast enough, and the lighter separates from the heavier, like a milk separator. Back then, they tried to build one of those, and Westinghouse had one, and it blew up immediately. They couldn't build one with the materials and machining technology they had back then. Today, that is our only source, and so when you hear Iran building all these centrifuges, putting them online, that's really for one use, and that is to build a bomb. Because to enrich uranium, you only have to enrich it up to about 5% enrichment from 7/10. And that is for use in nuclear reactors. Once you get above 5%, it is no longer has any application except in a bomb. It takes about 90% enrichment to actually get a bomb, make a bomb. So it takes a long time because you're separating one atom at a time. There were other sources or equipment that could be used, and one is the electromagnetic separation, and the other is gaseous diffusion. Both those facilities were built in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, requiring a great amount of energy, electricity. We sited it down in Oak Ridge because they had the TVA project, which had just been completed. They had an excess of electricity there. And at the time Oak Ridge was up and running, 10% of all the electrical power in the country was flowing into Oak Ridge. They worked and worked and worked, and they had enough uranium to have one bomb. And that they knew Japan wouldn't surrender with one bomb. And actually they didn't, it took two. The other very recent discovery, though, was the discovery of plutonium. Glenn Seaborg and his group out in Berkeley had just discovered it in 1941. That's just right at the time we entered World War II. We know very little about it except we had a cyclotron sample of it. Knew very little about its mechanical properties. But they knew that they could produce it much faster, because what you do is you put uranium in a reactor and irradiate it, and one of the daughter products coming out is plutonium. Plutonium is element 94, so it's a different element, and you can separate them chemically. So this then was all done out in Hanford. That's east of Seattle, out in the Hanford Reservation. They had to set up these tremendously large reactors to produce the plutonium. They bought up 500,000 acres of land out there, moved 1,500 landowners off, and set the reservation up. Built 3 large reactors then, and in our museum we have an exhibit on that. We have a picture of the B reactor, the first one to actually start producing plutonium. But we were producing at the time, just before we dropped a bomb, enough plutonium for one bomb drop a week. So although we only had one uranium for one bomb, we had multiple sources for multiple weapons. Therefore, we could test the plutonium bomb. The uranium bomb went into what was called a gun-type weapon. Initially, they thought that both plutonium and uranium would work in a gun-type weapon. They suspected, though, at that time that plutonium was more fissionable than uranium, which would take a longer gun barrel. You had to bring the two parts together fast enough, because as the two parts would come together, they would spontaneously start to fission and would heat up and melt, and you couldn't hold it together long enough. They thought that plutonium would take a gun barrel about 17 feet long, and they started to design it, called Thin Man, because it would be a snap then if they could get that to work, that they could, all they had to do was shorten it down to work with uranium. When they got the first samples that they could measure the mechanical properties of U-235, they found it was more than 5 times more fissionable than they thought it would be. And that was because of another contaminating material in it that they couldn't remove. They got those samples then from a reactor at Oak Ridge, which was a prototype to the ones that eventually were built in Hanford. They got it from there, and that's when they discovered this problem that they had. No matter how long they would make the gun barrel, they couldn't bring it together fast enough that it wouldn't melt in advance and not form a chain reaction. So Oppie almost resigned. They knew that one bomb wouldn't end the war. By the time they would be able to fabricate enough uranium for a second one, we would have already invaded the mainland of Japan in November of 1945, and we wouldn't have been able to use a weapon, an atomic weapon, because our troops would be there. We'd be wiping out our own people. So Oppie almost resigned, but they had been working up at Los Alamos in what is called the Implosion Concept. In the uranium fission, you can figure out 2 different ways of having it work. You can either have what's called an infinite mass, which is so large that to a neutron, even though you don't slow it down, cannot get out of it without hitting another nucleus. The other way is that you can take the mass of uranium and squeeze it down, double its density, so that everything is packed so tight that the neutron can't get out, even though it's not slowed down. Those 2 concepts then, the implosion then, is a weapon which is the heart of the Fat Man bomb. We named the uranium bomb Little Boy and Fat Man bomb, both of which are on display at the museum. The Fat Man bomb employs this implosion concept, which is an explosive sphere that the parts of it are designed to implode rather than exploding. So there are 32 faces, and each of these have 32 detonator. So you have 32 detonators that all have to be detonated simultaneously. That then was tested at Trinity, a copy, and we have it on display, a replica of it called the Gadget, 5-foot diameter sphere that implodes and squeezes the uranium mass, or in this case, the plutonium mass, down into doubles its density and explodes. That was the primary test for the Trinity Test. It was called the Simultaneity Problem. Could they have all these 32 detonators on a 5-foot diameter sphere go off exactly simultaneously, because if one goes off, it would just blow apart and it wouldn't create that imploding sphere coming down in and squeezing the plutonium. That then was the Fat Man bomb. The next step then, after the bombing of Japan then, Edward Teller and Ulam wanted to continue building a hydrogen bomb. Oppenheimer wanted to stop development of atomic weapons. He was a pacifist, really. He didn't want to go on. So Teller and Ulam then left Los Alamos and went out to Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, and set up the development of the hydrogen bomb out there. The hydrogen bomb is what is called a two-stage bomb. You use the fission part that we had in the weapon that we dropped on Japan, and you use the electromagnetic energy coming out of that, the radiation coming out, plus the temperature to actually fuse deuterium. And that's what the process is done in the sun. In fusing the deuterium then, you don't split the nucleus, you take two nucleuses and you combine them into one. When you do that, you have a lot more excess energy given off. And that's the greater power of the hydrogen bomb. And that's really a two-stage weapon. We probably have a misnomer calling it a hydrogen bomb. It's actually a thermonuclear bomb, where you use the heat and radiation from the initial to actually do a second irradiation of the secondary part of the weapon. When you see all the equipment and everything, our display on Los Alamos, you don't see computers. You see slide rules and you see some 90-key Marchant mechanical calculators, and those were used. However, what you don't see is the fact that we had 21 Nobel laureates working on the Manhattan Project. This is one of the big reasons that Germany failed. Heisenberg was running the German program, and he had told the Army that they were having difficulty because their graphite, we use graphite in our reactors, but theirs had an impurity in it, and they didn't realize it, and their graphite wasn't working. So he had told the Army that it would probably be 5 years before they could develop a weapon. They had lost their source of deuterium, which was the other material, when the Norwegians blew up the only plant in the world producing it in Norway. So they were kind of stuck, and so Heisenberg told the Army that it would be about 5 years. Germany's what they thought, and Hitler thought it would only last 2 or 3 years, World War II, because he would have already conquered the world. So they gave it a low priority. We didn't know that, though. We had to assume that they were going full bore toward developing the bomb. The other thing that Heisenberg didn't realize, that the Holocaust had driven out the top scientists. Heisenberg told the Army if they couldn't do it, nobody in the world could. German science was very, very arrogant. They looked down on all scientists, not realizing that their best people were driven out because they were German Jews, and the Holocaust drove them over here. So we had the brain power. We didn't have computers, though, and the two, I think, offset. Why did we need to test the Fat Man bomb? Initially, they thought that both plutonium and uranium would work in a gun-type weapon. Gun-type weapon is just a cannon-like barrel where you have half the material at one end, you have the other half at the other end, and you have explosives that blow the two pieces together. They found out, though, that plutonium was too fissionable to work in a gun-type weapon. Uranium would. That weapon is called Little Boy. The other concept, though, that they had worked with was what was called implosion, which is a spherical mass of explosives in pieces that are actually explosive lenses. When that each are detonated, actually the explosives look like the soccer ball. If you've ever counted the faces on a soccer ball, there are 32 of them. If you put a detonator on each of these, on a ball that's 5 feet in diameter, soccer ball's 5 feet in diameter, and you touch off each of those detonators exactly simultaneously, the explosive force through the explosive lenses are directed inward instead of outward. So you can take a sphere of plutonium and you can squeeze it down, double its density, and it'll go into an atomic explosion. We only had enough uranium for one bomb. That would all go into Little Boy and eventually be dropped in Hiroshima. But at Hanford in Washington State, it's about 75 miles or 100 miles east of Seattle, out on the Hanford Reservation. We had built 3 very large reactors that were really outgrowths of CP1. CP1 was just a very small version. This now is a production scale reactors. And we were producing enough uranium at that time. We had 4 in our really possession when we dropped the first bomb. We were producing enough for about 3 bomb drops a month. So we had enough to test. We couldn't test the gun-type weapon because we only had one. But we could test the Fat Man, and the scientists wanted to do that because it was so complex compared to the gun-type weapon. So they set up then the Trinity Test site to do that. It's just about 100 miles by the way the crow flies down there on the north end of White Sands Missile Range. They bought up about 275,000 acres on what was then the Alamogordo Bombing and Gunnery Range, and placed all the instrumentation and everything for tests there. Built a 100-foot tall tower to have the test vehicle, which they codenamed the Gadget, which is the insides of the Fat Man bomb. Place it on top of the tower and then explode it. One of the big things they were testing for is what was called the Simultaneity Problem. All 32 of these detonators had to go off exactly simultaneously. So you've got even the length of the wires around the ball. They solved that very simply, though. They cut all the wires the same length, so that we're talking about such small increments of time that the speed of light, which is the speed of the electrons in the wires, is a differentiating factor. The test then was conducted July 16th, 1945. It was successful. At that time then, we knew we could have enough bombs to go to war with them before we invaded Japan mainland conventionally. Had we done that, it would have been a horror that we can't begin to imagine now. Fortunately, we got the bombs first, the atomic bombs. 3 weeks later then, they dropped the first one on Hiroshima, which was the little boy, the gun-type weapon. Dropped that, and it dropped it first, even though it had never been tested, because they were confident enough that it would work, that its reliability was really greater than this very complex implosion weapon, where we'd tested it once, but weren't sure that it might work a second time. So it, though, then was dropped on Nagasaki. So the Trinity Test then is an event that, there are two events there. The initial reactor, CP1, when that went active, it really changed the history of the world. The second test that really changed the history of the world is the Trinity Test, the largest scientific experiment ever conducted, when it really changed the history of the world. I think the third event in the Manhattan Project that changed the history of the world was the actual bombing of Japan. Those three events were very crucial during that period of time. My life story really begins in Dayton, Ohio, a suburb just outside. I graduated from a small high school there and became interested in physics. So I applied to Heidelberg University in northwestern Ohio and went to school there. While I was there, I met my wife. We dated for 3.5 years and got married just after I graduated. One of the physics majors a year ahead of me had gotten an application for Sandia Laboratories here in Albuquerque. And he did not pursue that, but he gave me the information on it. I sent it in and got a trip out here. My wife was also interested in coming out to the Southwest. We wanted to get away from Ohio because I'd also spent time in Case at that time, Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland, and we'd gone very tired of Ohio winters, so we wanted to get away from that. I came out here for an interview, and it was in March, and it was really bad weather back in Ohio at that time, and the morning of the interview that they flew me out for, the plane went to Chicago, and it was a blizzard, and we were afraid the plane wouldn't get off the ground. The plane finally did. At that time, it was a propeller-based plane, the old TWA Constellation. From Chicago to Albuquerque was a 5-hour flight at that time. We got into Albuquerque then, and we landed at the old original Sunport, where you got off the plane and walked into the terminal. When we landed, I looked out the window, and it was just at sunset. Sun was just going down, and I looked down on the ground, and the ground crews were all in short short sleeves. And I thought, boy, it must be fairly warm here. And so at that time, the planes had staircases that rolled up to them. Got out on the landing, looked out, and I said, Sandia, make me an offer. The answer is yes. And so had the interview and went back to Ohio. We came out here then in June. And that was in 1956. I then went to work at Sandia, worked there 38 years in 7 different careers. I started in materials lab. Next went into the technical training group. From there, I was a staff member to the president of Sandia. Then became a executive assistant vice president of research, and then into the manager of emergency preparedness. So it was quite a varied career, and it's really made possible because at Sandia, at that time there were 7,000 employees, and it was easy to move around in Sandia from job to job. So you can work for the same place, but have a different career. I retired then in 1994 after 38 years, and became interested in the museum at that time. And I've been there a docent now for 20 years here at the museum. In my last 7 years at Sandia, I managed emergency preparedness. And in that time, about the last 3 years, DOE put into effect what was called occurrence reporting. They wanted to know immediately if we had a problem, if we had an accident, if we had a spill or any hazardous material. They needed to know that immediately. That was called occurrence reporting. So I had the Emergency Operations Center, and any time that we had one of these problems, then we had to contact DOE headquarters in some of them, if it were, say, something radioactive, had to notify them in 15 minutes. And so we're there, and I'm there, working with the, what we called the duty officer then, to transmit these messages to DOE. We had differing, depending on the how serious the accident or problem that we had different times that we had to get to DOE the information, which is fine, except the big problem was that I had to get to my management, either vice president or whoever was sitting in that week as duty officer, the information before DOE got back to them and informed them that we were having an accident, because they didn't want to get in that position. So I'm there with a 15-minute to get to DOE, but yet to get to our management and tell them that what had happened. Well, of course, within 15 minutes in any emergency, you don't hardly have any facts. You know, we got the building's on fire, so you go to your management, I go to my management, and of course they want to know all the detail. You know, what caused it, you know, what's the damage, because they want to have enough answers to DOE so that when DOE calls them, that they've got the answers. And that really puts you in really a interesting situation, one that retirement looks awfully good.
you.